With the news breaking that Vice President Kamala Harris has now chosen Minnesota's Governor Tim Walz to be her running mate, I think it's important that you understand a handful of things about Tim Walz from a guy that's lived in Minnesota and as someone who has been involved in Minnesota politics since 2006. I know a thing or two about Governor Tim Walz. Number one, you cannot believe a single word that comes out of his mouth. He lies in order to keep power. He might come off as some type of moderate or some type of rational, normal person, when in fact, he never makes a single move without calculating whether or not it will gain him power or lose him power. It doesn't matter what the situation is. There could be a bill that goes through the legislature, goes through the House and the Senate, and it's on its way to the governor's mansion, and he decides, I'm not going to sign this. Why doesn't he sign this leftist progressive garbage bill that comes to his desk? Is it because he's not a leftist? Wrong. It's because he understands that the public sentiment about that bill is one that will lose him power. When it comes to criminal aliens, he believes that Minnesota should be a refuge for them. What's the proof? Well, he signed several bills that gave criminal aliens the same rights as American citizens and Minnesota residents. For instance, in Minnesota, if you are a criminal alien, you can attend college completely tuition free. If you live in Minnesota and you're a criminal alien, you get access to state-funded Medicaid. That's healthcare. If you're in Minnesota and you're a criminal alien, it's perfectly fine for you to apply and receive a state-issued ID along with a driver's license. Again, even though you are not an American citizen, fully understanding that you are here illegally. Governor Tim Walz believes that a woman has a right to choose up until the point that she delivers her baby. He signed a bill that codified abortion up to the moment that the woman gives birth. And technically, because of some of the language in this bill, you could argue that even if the baby is delivered, that is now legal. We call that infanticide. When it comes to teaching sexual materials to children in elementary schools, you guessed it, Tim Walz is 100% on board. One of the challenges that I issued publicly was that Tim Walz should take a list of these books that he claimed that Republicans were trying to ban and read them live on public access television, complete with huge blow-ups of the illustrations in the books. Because after all, if there's nothing to worry about, that these are books that every elementary child and older should be able to consume, then why wouldn't he do it? Governor Tim Walz signed a bill making Minnesota a trans refuge state for children. And the way that the language of the bill is written, you could argue that someone could kidnap a child under the premise that that child's guardian or parent was not affirming their gender identity, bring them to Minnesota, and Minnesota's law enforcement would not help to put that child back with the actual legal guardians, as long as it was all under the idea that this other person that just kidnapped someone else's child was doing it to affirm their gender. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. During COVID, he signed multiple executive orders that locked the state down. He said it was perfectly fine to go to Walmart, but to that mom and pop business, sorry, you can't go there. In fact, he made it illegal to attend church services. There was a time in which you could not have more than 10 people gathering in a single location for any reason. Famously, he said during a holiday season, I believe it was either Christmas or Thanksgiving, actually might have been both of them, that you should not get together with non-residential family members. He actually created a snitch hotline where if you saw someone out breaking the COVID restriction lockdown rules, you could report it anonymously to the government, and they'll go and investigate and shut down whatever type of virus spreading events were occurring. Now let's move into the dark side of his policies. During the lockdowns, he made it illegal for people to gather for things such as substance abuse counseling. Now you tell me, if you understand anything about mental health or substance abuse, do you think that getting rid of in-person group therapy sessions was a good thing or a bad thing? Well, in fact, we actually have some numbers based off of that. The amount of overdose deaths skyrocketed during the lockdowns, again, because of Governor Tim Walz's executive orders. Now, one of the darkest policies that was ever put into place by Tim Walz was discharging COVID-positive patients into nursing homes, long-term care facilities, and community living settings. And I know this firsthand because my mother was in a nursing home. And when we were unable to physically go and see her in person, I would talk to the other staff and nurses, and they would explain that they would be receiving certain patients that they would find out days after they were admitted had tested positive for COVID. And by the time they had learned that there were COVID positive patients, all of the staff were spreading it around the entire facilities. And guess what happens when people who were the most vulnerable and most susceptible to dying from COVID or dying with COVID? Guess what happened to them? Oh yeah, they died. In fact, there was a point at which 81% of all COVID deaths in the state of Minnesota were occurring in these exact same settings. Out of all the things that Governor Tim Walz did or didn't do, to me the most egregious were all of the events surrounding George Floyd. First, when it came to the actual death of George Floyd, he was one of the first people without evidence to go and vilify law enforcement, and specifically the officers that were involved in that incident. He called it murder. Do you think that that inflamed the situation, or do you think it calmed it down? And how long did it take Governor Tim Walz to actually call up the National Guard to intercede with the riots that caused hundreds of millions of dollars of damage in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area? It took him 3 days. The mayor of Minneapolis, who is no friend to me, who is a guy that is just as garbage and as pitiful as Tim Walz, but at least he was like, please call in the National Guard. My city is burning. But to me, what really takes the cake is how he allowed the 3rd Minneapolis Police Precinct to be given over to the rioters. He said, you know what? This building is not worth trying to defend, knowing full well that it meant that that entire area was going to have lawlessness running rampant. And what happens when a bunch of lawless thugs and criminals have no fear that law enforcement will stop them? Yeah, they're going to be lawless thugs and criminals. They're going to victimize the people that live in those areas. And don't even get me started when it comes to all of the waste, fraud, and abuse that have happened under Governor Tim Walz's watch. Now, some would argue that maybe he's just absent-minded. I would actually make the argument that he allowed it to happen on purpose because he is a leftist. He believes that it's perfectly fine for people that are using the system to abuse the system. Redistribution of wealth, baby. Now, based off of reporting done by Center of the American Experiment, and specifically Bill Glahn, those estimates right now are sitting at about $550 million. So here's what you really need to understand. There is not a single leftist, progressive, Marxist, or communist policy that Tim Walz doesn't support. The only question as to whether or not he's going to support it is whether or not it is accepted by the public. So there you go. Vice President Kamala Harris and Minnesota Governor Tim Walz are a perfect match for each other. A match born in communist Marxist hell.